$200. That was everything Vivien Rivera owned in the world, folded into a worn leather wallet that had belonged to her mother 15 years ago. The bills were creased from counting them obsessively, handled so many times the texture had changed, become soft like fabric instead of paper. She knew the exact weight of them in her pocket. She knew how long they would last. 3 days. Maybe 4 if she skipped meals, and skipping meals was something she had become expert at. The phone buzzed in her hand at 11:08 p.m. as she walked home through the November rain, and her stomach seized into a fist. 3 days left. Those were the only words Preston Mercer had sent, but Vivien understood the full weight of what was unspoken beneath them. 3 days to produce $85,000, or he would make good on the threats he had been making for 6 months now. Not threats against her. Threats against Noah. Against her 7-year-old son who still slept with a nightlight shaped like a moon because he was terrified of the dark, who drew pictures of houses with smoke coming from the chimneys, who still believed the world was safe because his mother had spent every moment of his life trying to make it so. She walked faster through the warehouse district, her shoes splashing through puddles that reflected the sick neon green of a sign advertising a bar that had been closed for 2 years. The rain fell sideways in the November wind, the kind of rain that umbrellas could not defeat, that soaked through coats and made breath visible in small white clouds. Her black coat was thin, purchased from a thrift store 3 winters ago, and it no longer kept out anything except the memory of warmth. The footsteps came first. Then the voices. Vivien heard them before she saw them, a low rumble of male laughter echoing off the brick walls of the warehouse on her right. She quickened her pace without meaning to, her keys already in her hand, fingers threaded between them the way the other maids at Harrington House had taught her. "Make yourself smaller," they always said. "Do not look up. Do not be seen." But the screaming stopped her dead in the middle of the sidewalk. It came from the alley 30 feet ahead, a sound of pure agony that did not sound human, that sounded like something being torn apart. Vivien's feet moved before her mind caught up with them, before the terrified voice inside her head could convince her that this was not her problem, that she had enough problems of her own, that inserting herself into danger was the opposite of what a mother should do. She rounded the corner into the alley and froze. 4 men in black leather jackets stood in a semicircle, their guns raised, their faces twisted into expressions of casual cruelty. On the ground in front of them, collapsed against a dumpster with its metal side streaked with rust, was a man in an expensive grey suit that had been tailored to fit him like a second skin. Blood pooled around him, dark and thick, spreading across the wet asphalt like spilled wine. His hand was pressed against his side where the fabric had been torn open, where crimson seeped relentlessly through his fingers. His breathing came in wet, rattling gasps, and his eyes were fever-bright and unfocused, rolling slightly in their sockets as his body went into shock. The gunman did not even glance at Vivien when she stepped forward. One of them spat at the bleeding man's feet. Another laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The third raised his gun higher, aiming at the man's chest, and that was when Vivien's hands moved of their own accord, when her fingers found the buttons of her coat and began to unfasten them with shaking hands. "Leave him alone," she said, and she was shocked by how steady her voice sounded, how calm, when everything inside her was trembling like a candle in the wind. "He is hurt. He is bleeding. Leave him alone." The gunman turned to look at her then, and in their eyes she saw the same expression she had seen countless times before in the faces of powerful men, the look of someone regarding an insect on the sidewalk, something too small and insignificant to be anything but an annoyance. One of them raised his hand to strike her. A whistle cut through the rain. High and piercing. A single note that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing off the brick walls until it was impossible to tell its source. The 4 men froze. They exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them, and then they were moving, scattering into the rain like cockroaches when the light came on, their boots splashing through puddles, their shadows disappearing into the darkness of the warehouse district until they were gone as if they had never been. Vivien's coat fell from her shoulders and hit the wet pavement with a soft thud. She did not stop to think about what she was doing. She sank to her knees beside the bleeding man and pressed her only scarf against the wound in his side, her hand slipping in the blood, her fingers too weak to apply adequate pressure. The man's eyes rolled toward her, and for a moment they focused, became sharp and aware, and she saw in them something that made her breath catch. Intelligence. Power. A will so fierce it seemed to bend the very air around him. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist. Not gently. His fingers were ice-cold and his grip had the crushing strength of a man who was used to holding things until they broke. "Your name," he whispered, his voice like gravel, like something dragged through broken glass. "Tell me your name." "Vivien," she breathed. "Vivien Rivera." The sound of sirens approached through the rain, growing louder, the red and white lights beginning to reflect off the brick walls. The man's grip on her wrist loosened, became almost tender for a moment, and his lips moved as if he was trying to speak, trying to say something important. But then the paramedics were rushing into the alley, shouting instructions to each other, and they were pulling her away from him, separating her hands from his wound, and the man was being lifted onto a stretcher, and Vivien was on her knees in the rain clutching her empty scarf and watching as the ambulance pulled away into the November darkness, carrying the stranger with her coat still draped across his shoulders, carrying him away like he was taking a piece of her with him. One of the paramedics was asking her questions. Was she hurt? Did she need medical attention? Was she a friend of the injured man? Vivien stood on shaking legs. She picked up her empty coat from the sidewalk. It was soaked through with rainwater and blood, and it felt heavier than it had before, like it was weighted down with something she could not name. "No," she told the paramedic, her voice barely a whisper now. "I do not know him. I was just walking home." But what she did not know in that moment, as she stood in the rain with her coat dripping blood onto her feet, was that the man she had just saved was Dominic Valenti, the most feared crime boss in New Orleans, a man who had spent the last 15 years building an empire of violence and fear, a man who had given orders that resulted in people disappearing into the bayou and never resurfacing. He was the kind of man who never forgot a face, who kept elaborate records of debts both owed and received, who had learned long ago that mercy was a weakness that could only be afforded by the strong. And from the moment he heard her name whispered against the sound of falling rain, Vivien Rivera had become marked. Every moment of her life from this point forward would be watched. Every threat against her would be noted. Every tear she shed would be counted and remembered. But she did not know that yet. She only knew that she was cold, that she had given away her only coat to a dying stranger, that she still had 3 days to find $85,000 or Preston Mercer would destroy the only thing in the world that mattered to her. She only knew that she was nobody. A maid in a black and white uniform. Invisible. Forgotten. Now let us go back. Back to 3 weeks earlier, when Vivien Rivera was still just another shadow moving through the hallways of the Harrington mansion, still counting her meager wages, still unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. 3 weeks before the rain-slicked alley, before the vendor collapsed into her arms, before Dominic Valenti's eyes found her in the darkness, Vivien Rivera was still invisible. She moved through the Valenti mansion like a ghost, like smoke that could pass through walls without leaving a trace. Her uniform was black and white, starched and pressed, the colors of absence. The colors of people no one looked at twice. The marble floor stretched before her on a Tuesday morning, reflecting the crystal chandelier overhead like a frozen lake. She knelt on the cold stone, her fingers wrapped in a damp cloth, scrubbing at a scuff mark that had been there for weeks. Her knees ached. Her back ached. Her hands were raw from bleach and hot water, the skin around her nails stained permanent yellow. 27 years old but looking closer to 40, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and a thinness that came not from choice but from counting every dollar, every meal, rationing breakfast down to black coffee and a slice of toast. Footsteps echoed across the marble. Male voices. Heavy. Expensive shoes. She did not look up. This was the rule she had learned in 2 years of cleaning wealthy homes, in 3 years of waitressing, in 7 years of survival since Noah was born. You make yourself smaller. You become the walls. You do not exist in the space occupied by important men. The boss will be back from Seoul next month, one voice said. Vinny. The tall one with the scar across his knuckle and rings on every finger. The operation in Busan went clean. No interference from the triads. The other voice was Franco's, lower, gravelly, like he smoked cigarettes down to the filter. The girls from the docks. What about them? Handled. Their footsteps moved past her without pause, without acknowledgement. She was less real than the marble beneath her hands. Less real than the shadows that fell across the floor when clouds moved past the sun outside the tall windows. She continued scrubbing. The rhythm was meditative if she let it be, if she did not think about the numbers in her head, if she did not think about the phone that would buzz in exactly 3 days with a message that would change everything. The second floor was hers to clean on Tuesdays and Fridays. She climbed the mahogany staircase, her bucket sloshing water that left small wet marks on each step. At the top, a hallway stretched left and right, lined with oil paintings of men with cold eyes and women draped in pearls. One door on the left was always closed. She had asked about it once, months ago, when she was still new and stupid enough to ask questions. The housekeeper's name was Rosa. Older, perhaps 60, with grey threaded through her black hair and a kindness in her face that did not match this place. Rosa had pulled her aside in the kitchen, down by the pantry where no one could hear. "Do not go in that room," Rosa had said simply. "Do not even open the door to clean it." Why? Because his son. He lost his son when the baby was 2 days old. 15 years ago now. He never moved a thing. The crib is still there. The blanket still folded on the chair. The mobile hanging above the bed. Rosa's eyes had grown distant, sad. Some men, they grieve like that. They seal a room and let it sit like a monument to what they lost. Vivien had nodded and never asked again. But sometimes, as she cleaned the hallway, she would pause in front of that closed door and think about a man she had never met, who owned this mansion and the lives of everyone in it, grieving a child who had lived only 2 days. She wondered if that grief made him human or less human. She wondered if a man who could hold that much sadness could also be the kind of man who made people disappear. She did not want to know the answer. Her apartment was 7 miles away, a shotgun rental on a street where the paint peeled from the walls and the neighbors kept their windows barred. 2 small rooms and a bathroom where the shower sometimes flooded the toilet. She paid $675 a month, which meant the math was always the same: rent, food, Noah's school fees, the debt. Always the debt. It was 6 o'clock in the evening when she returned home. Noah was at his after-school program until 7, which gave her exactly 1 hour to breathe, to sit at the small table that wobbled when you leaned on it, and to pull out the piece of paper that she had hidden in the drawer beneath her underclothes, beneath everything, where nothing else dared to look. The handwriting was hers, dated 6 months earlier. A list. A catalogue of ruin. Preston Mercer, $85,000. Borrowed 2019 for Mama's treatment. Mama gone 2021. He wants it back. Medical bills from when Noah broke his arm, $4,200. Insurance denied. Pre-existing condition claim. Lies. Rent 3 months behind to avoid eviction, $2,025. Gloria will not wait much longer. Noah's winter coat and boots, $180. December coming. He needs warm things. The list went on. It grew like a cancer. She had tried to stop adding to it, but the expenses never stopped. They never stopped. There was always something breaking, always something failing, always another debt to append to the bottom. She pulled the cash from her purse. $217. She had worked 3 jobs last week. 14-hour days. Her feet were blistered. Her shoulders carried knots of muscle so tight they felt like rope pulled too far. $217. She did the math again, even though she had done it 1,000 times. 85,000 divided into 200. Divided into days. Divided into desperation. Her phone sat on the table. She picked it up. The text messages were organized by date, oldest first. She kept them. She did not know why she kept them, but she did, scrolling through them sometimes at 3 in the morning when she could not sleep, when Noah was dreaming in the next room, when the weight of everything sat on her chest like a stone. I gave you everything. You owe me. June 15th. You think you can just walk away from me? Take my son. June 18th. I have friends at the precinct. Good friends. One call and they take him. CPS. Evaluate the home. Gone in 6 months. June 22nd. You have until August 15th. Bring me the money or watch what happens to Noah. June 23rd. August 15th had come and gone. She had cried that day, sitting in her car during her break at the diner, crying so hard she could not breathe. She had borrowed from her sister. She had picked up extra shifts. She had sold her mother's jewelry, the only thing she had left, and she had scraped together $22,000. He had rejected it. All of it, his message had said. 85. Not a penny less. This is not negotiation, Vivien. This is consequence for what you have done. What she had done was leave him. What she had done was refuse to let Noah watch his mother get shoved against walls. What she had done was survive. She set the phone down and looked at her hands. Thin hands. Yellow fingers. Palms calloused and cracked. The hands of a woman who cleaned other people's homes, who had never owned anything that mattered, who had gotten pregnant at 19 to a man who smiled like Sunday and hit like Monday. There were 3 days left. 3 days to find $85,000. 3 days before Preston came to collect. The phone buzzed. Her heart jumped. It was not Preston. It was a message from the after-school program coordinator. Noah asking about winter clothes. Should we send him home in what he has? December was coming. She typed back, I will get him what he needs. She did not know how. She did not know how she was going to do any of this. But she typed the words anyway, because Noah could not know that she was failing. Noah could not know that his mother was running out of time. At exactly 6:58 p.m., her phone chimed with the chime that meant Noah had been picked up from the program. She stood, pocketed the cash, hid the list back in the drawer beneath her underclothes, and went to the window to wait for the car to arrive. The November sky was already dark, clouds moving in from the east like a warning no one had asked for. The private plane touched down at Louis Armstrong Airport at 11:44 p.m., wheels hitting wet tarmac with a sound like thunder. Rain hammered the fuselage. Dominic Valenti sat in the leather seat, his left side wrapped tight beneath his Italian silk shirt, the wound still burning from the meeting that went wrong. 30 minutes of negotiation with the Castellano family had dissolved into gunfire when they decided they wanted more than territory. They wanted him dead. His men scattered, regrouping in the rain-soaked warehouse district 2 blocks away, searching for him in the darkness while Dominic pressed his hand against the bleeding in his ribs and stumbled into the alley, vision swimming, the world tilting sideways. 4 of their men found him cornered against a brick wall that smelled like rust and rain. Dominic was 6'2", 220 pounds of muscle that had survived 2 decades in the underworld, but blood loss made him weak. Made him human. Made him vulnerable in a way his enemies had never seen. One of the men raised his weapon. The shot would have taken him in the center of mass if not for the woman who appeared in the November darkness like an apparition, her black coat threadbare, her brown eyes fierce and terrified and absolutely steady. "Leave him alone," she said. Her voice trembled like a candle in the wind, but the words came out solid. "He's hurt. Please." The gunman laughed. The smallest one stepped toward her and Dominic forced himself upright, forced words through gritted teeth. "Do not touch her." But she was already moving. She unwrapped the coat from her own thin shoulders, her breath clouding in the cold, and draped it across his shoulders like she was soothing a wounded animal. The coat was worth nothing. It smelled of cheap lavender detergent and her skin and something else, something like courage. It was warm. It was the first warmth he had felt in hours. "Your name," Dominic said, his voice cracking. Blood ran down his side beneath the coat. He gripped her wrist, felt how thin she was, how fragile, and how she did not pull away. "Tell me your name." "Vivien Rivera." A whistle cut through the rain. Vinny's whistle. The gunmen scattered like roaches when the lights come on, and suddenly the alley filled with men in black suits, weapons drawn, the Valenti empire closing around its boss like a fist. As the paramedics arrived with their stretchers and their urgent voices, Dominic kept the coat wrapped around him. He kept her name in his mouth like a prayer. In the ambulance, with the siren screaming through the New Orleans night, Dominic held the coat in his hands. It was still warm. The fabric was worn soft from 1,000 washings, and in the overhead light he could see where she had mended a seam by hand, her stitches small and careful. He pressed it to his chest like it was holy. Vinny sat across from him, his face pale, his hands still shaking from the violence. "Boss," he said carefully. "We need to talk about security. About what happened in that warehouse." Dominic did not look away from the coat. "Find her," he said. His voice was steady now, low and solid like an oath. "Find out everything about her. Where she lives. Who she knows. What she wants. Everything. The woman in the alley." Vinny's voice climbed. "Boss, you never." "Everything," Dominic repeated. The coat sat on the empty stretcher beside him, and for the first time in 8 years since his son Marco died, since he closed the door to the nursery upstairs and never opened it again, something in Dominic's chest cracked open like an egg. Like the shell of a man made entirely of ice was beginning to thaw. 24 hours later, with the wound stitched and bandaged, with antibiotics flowing through his veins and his empire secure, Dominic sat in his home office while Vinny delivered the report. The office smelled like mahogany and old money. Rain streamed down the windows. New Orleans sprawled beyond the glass like a woman sleeping, dangerous and beautiful and oblivious to the men who ran it from the shadows. Vivien Rivera, Vinny read from the file, his voice steady and professional. 29 years old. Works 3 jobs. House cleaning service, restaurant shift work at Celestine's, and night shift data entry at a call center. She has a son, Noah, age 7. Her ex-boyfriend is Preston Mercer. Sergeant with NOPD, 13 years on the force, and here's the problem, boss. Vinny's jaw tightened. He's got 6 officers in his pocket. She filed for restraining order requests. All denied. Dominic's fingers stilled on the desk. There's more. She took out a medical loan 5 years ago for her mother's cancer treatment. $200,000 at the time. She's paid down to $85,000. She's been living like a ghost to pay it. But Mercer, he's claiming the debt. Says she owes him $85,000 or he's filing a Child Protective Services report claiming she's unfit. He's given her a deadline. When? Dominic said. 3 days from now. And boss, with his connections. Dominic stood, walked to the window, looked out at the rain. Somewhere in this city, Vivien Rivera was working, was cleaning, was counting dollars and praying to a God that had stopped listening to her prayers a long time ago. Somewhere in this city, she was invisible. She moved through rooms in her black and white uniform with her head lowered, and the world stepped past her like she was furniture. He had never seen her. He had cleaned his mansion twice a week for 6 months and he had never truly seen her, and that fact sat in his chest like a stone. Find her address, Dominic said quietly. I'm going to help her. 2 days later, a Thursday morning at 9 a.m., Vivien arrived at the Valenti mansion for her regular shift. She had slept maybe 4 hours in the past 61 hours. 1 day remained on Preston's deadline. Her eye was starting to bruise from where he had shoved her against the wall of the bodega on Magazine Street, his hand around her throat, his voice promising things no mother should have to hear. She wore sunglasses to hide it. She wore a turtleneck to hide the fingerprints blooming like flowers on her skin. She came in through the service entrance, head down, pushing her cleaning cart past the marble foyer. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and cream. She knelt on the tile floor and began to scrub, her fingers methodical, her movements the same as always. Push, pull, ring. Push, pull, ring. This was what invisibility looked like. This was what survival tasted like. It tasted like bleach. Franco saw her first. The big man, Dominic's right hand for 12 years, turned from the refrigerator and his face went white. "Mary, Mother of God," he whispered. Vinnie appeared seconds later, his eyes moving from her swollen cheek to the edge of the handprints visible at her collar. "Who did this?" His voice was sharp. "Who?" Vivien couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, I'll work faster, please don't fire me." The kitchen door opened. Dominic entered. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. His eyes, dark as a winter storm, rimmed with sleeplessness, moved across her face, took in the damage, the fear, the way she was trying to make herself smaller. He wore an Italian suit that cost more than her annual rent, and his presence filled the space like a blade through butter. "Vinnie." "Franco." "Out." His voice was very quiet. They left without hesitation. Dominic approached slowly, each step measured, deliberate. "Sit down." She sat. He knelt in front of her. His men would see this later and not believe it, would argue about whether it actually happened, and his hands were gentle as they tilted her face toward the light. "I'm going to call a doctor. A good one. Someone who doesn't ask questions. You're going to let him look at you. And then you're going to tell me his name." Vivien's voice broke. "Why would you help me? I'm nobody. I'm just the maid. You don't even know I exist." Dominic reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made her breath catch. Her coat. The one she had given away in the alley 3 weeks ago. It had been cleaned, professionally mended, the worn seams reinforced with careful stitches that matched her own. "I know exactly who you are," Dominic said, and his voice was like thunder wrapped in velvet. "You gave a dying stranger your only coat in the rain. You didn't ask his name. You didn't want anything. You saved his life anyway. That makes you invisible to everyone in this city except one man. Do you understand?" The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her hands covered her mouth. "The alley? That was you?" "That was me." Over the next 4 hours, a doctor came and went. Broken rib. Severe contusions. The eye would heal. Franco brought soup that Vivien couldn't eat. Vinnie brought blankets and said nothing, but his face had changed. Dominic sat across the room, silent, listening as she told him everything. Preston Mercer. The debt. The threats. The CPS report he was going to file. Noah. Always Noah, the 7-year-old boy who had stopped asking why his mother came home crying. She showed him the list. Handwritten, worn, the numbers circled and recircled until the paper was nearly torn through. $85,000. "You needed $85,000, Dominic said slowly, "and you still gave a stranger your coat. He was dying. Money doesn't matter if you watch someone die and do nothing." Something cracked open in Dominic's face. He stood, turned away, made a phone call in rapid Italian, his voice becoming something hard and dangerous. When he returned, he knelt again and took her hand. "You and your son are moving into this house tonight. The guest wing. The rooms have their own entrance. You'll be safe here. Noah will be safe. Preston will not come near either of you. That is not a promise, Vivien. That is a law. I can't accept. In my world, there is a code. A life for a life. You saved me. Now I protect you. Both of you. This is not charity. This is debt. And I always pay my debts." Outside, the November rain fell like a blessing, and somewhere in the city, a man who called himself Preston Mercer was about to discover that some choices carry consequences that follow you into the dark. The November rain fell sideways against the mansion's tall windows, and Vivien sat in the garden with her hands trembling in her lap. Noah was asleep upstairs, finally asleep, and the house was quiet in the way that only empty places could be quiet. She had looked at her phone 3 times in the last hour. $200. That was all. The same number that had haunted her for weeks, the same impossible distance between survival and ruin. The rain drummed against the garden walls, steady and relentless, and she thought about the lies Margaret Harrington had sown through the garden district like poison. The poor maid is sleeping with him for money. Did you see those bruises? Probably staged for sympathy. That child isn't even hers, I heard she stole him. The whispers had multiplied. Yesterday at the grocery store, a woman she had known for 3 years had crossed to the other side of the aisle to avoid her. Another had clutched her purse tighter as Vivien passed. The bruises on her throat were fading from dark purple to sickly yellow-green, and everyone who saw them believed the worst. She pulled out the handwritten list again. $85,000. The numbers were circled so many times the pen had nearly torn through the paper. Her landlord. The hospital from when Noah had pneumonia. Preston's lawyer. The list of people who owned pieces of her, who would take pieces of Noah if she failed. 2 more jobs had evaporated after Margaret's campaign. Nobody wanted to hire the woman who was sleeping with the Mafia boss in the garden district. Nobody wanted that kind of scandal in their home. Through the kitchen window, she could see Dominic at the table with Noah, teaching him chess. Her son's small hands moved a pawn forward, and his face was lit up with concentration and something close to joy. He had not smiled like that in so long. Not in the years with Preston. Not in the nights when she came home with empty pockets and empty promises. Dominic sat across from him, patient, speaking in a voice she had never heard him use before, a voice like a man soothing a lost child. Noah laughed at something Dominic said, a real laugh, the kind that came from deep in his belly, and Vivien felt the decision crystallize inside her like ice forming on a frozen lake. She could not stay. She was destroying this. Every day she remained in this house, she brought danger closer to Noah. Margaret's lies were spreading like wildfire through the social circles, and Preston was still out there, still circling, still swearing he would take Noah away. That temporary custody order he had brought to the gates 3 days ago, forged, yes, but a warning of what was coming. The cops who stood beside him, smirking like this, was already won. She had seen their faces clearly. They worked for Preston. They would help him take her son. The rain intensified, and she thought about disappearing. Just leaving in the night. Taking Noah and vanishing into a different city, a different name, a different life. At least then this man would not be in danger. At least then the neighbors would stop whispering. She pulled up Dominic's number. Her finger hovered over the delete button. Then the kitchen light caught Noah's face again, and he was laughing, and Dominic was showing him how to castle his king, explaining the rules in a patient voice, and her son was leaning forward with the kind of focus and trust that children only give to people they know will not hurt them. Her hand dropped. She closed her eyes. The phone vibrated in her hand. A text from Dominic, "Come inside. It is cold." She had not told him she was outside. She had not made a sound. She simply sat, and yet he had known. In this house, he seemed to know everything. Vivien stood and walked back inside. The warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. Dominic looked up from the chessboard, and his eyes found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He did not ask where she had been. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and then he said something quiet that only she could hear, "Trust me." That night at 2 in the morning, 12 men in black moved like ghosts through the rain-slicked streets toward Preston's apartment in the lower garden district. No sirens. No announcement. Just the soft sound of boots on wet pavement and the almost inaudible click of a lock being breached. Dominic had made a phone call at sunset, spoken in rapid Italian, his voice becoming something hard and dangerous, a blade wrapped in ice. Now his men moved with tactical precision through Preston's bedroom door. Preston woke to darkness, then to the shape of 2 figures standing over his bed. Vinny on the left. Franco on the right. Both of them 6'2", both of them wearing black tactical gear that cost more than Preston's monthly salary, both of them with the cold calm of men who had done this hundreds of times before. Preston's hand shot toward his nightstand. The gun was not there. It was not on the dresser. It was not under the mattress. Franco held it up, the barrel catching what little light filtered through the windows. "Looking for this?" "You can't do this," Preston said, his voice cracking. "I'm a cop. I have friends." "I have?" "Friends," Vinny said quietly. "We know. We already visited them." And somewhere in New Orleans at exactly that same moment, FBI agents in dark suits were arriving at 4 different police precincts with federal warrants. The precinct captain who had been helping Preston. The desk sergeant who had forged the custody order. The 2 uniformed officers who had stood at Dominic's gates with smirks on their faces. All of them being escorted out in handcuffs as their fellow officers watched in stunned silence. Evidence appearing, bank deposits from Preston Mercer, bribery records, falsified reports, a tapestry of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight because nobody had looked. Back at Preston's apartment, he was being dragged from his bed. His underwear. No shoes. His skin pale and shaking as Vinny and Franco moved him toward the door with the kind of efficiency that meant they had done this 100 times before. He was screaming now, begging, his voice becoming something animal and desperate. "Dominic, please, please, Dominic, I'll disappear, I'll leave the city, I'll..." Vinny said nothing. He simply opened the door to the black SUV idling on the curb, and inside that SUV sat 2 men in dark coats that Preston recognized immediately. The Russo family. His face went white. The Russo family did not forgive. The Russo family did not forget. Preston had sold them out in a drug sting 2 years ago, had testified against them in federal court, had sent their lieutenant to prison for 18 years. "No, no, please, Dominic, please," Preston was screaming as they pulled him into the back of the SUV. Vinny watched the door close. The vehicle pulled into the November darkness, rain streaming down its windows. Franco stood beside him, both men silent for a moment. "Boss said no death," Franco said finally. "Too merciful." "Russos will keep him alive," Vinny replied. "Keep him conscious. Months in their basement, maybe longer. Repayment, interest, revenge for a betrayal they have been waiting to collect on. He wanted to take a child from a woman. Now he is nothing. Now he belongs to them." Meanwhile, across the city in the elegant mansion in the Garden District, Vivien woke to find Noah sleeping peacefully beside her in the guest room, his small hand wrapped around hers even in sleep. She had not gone out into the rain again. She had stayed. She had trusted. By dawn, federal agents arrived at Margaret Harrington's Garden District home with a warrant that detailed 3 separate counts of embezzlement from the charities she ran. The Foundation for Children's Literacy. The Hospital Fund for Uninsured Families. The women's shelter where she had sat on the board for 8 years, collecting donations while stealing from the accounts. Dominic's people had gathered the evidence methodically, had provided the bank records and the intercepted envelope containing $90,000 in cash that Margaret had kept from a recent fundraiser. The agents walked her out in her silk robe at sunrise. Cameras flashed. News vans pulled up. The neighbors she had cultivated, the people whose lives she had ruled with whispers and social cruelty, stood on their porches and said nothing as Margaret Harrington screamed that this was a mistake, that she was Margaret Harrington, that she would sue them, that her lawyers would destroy them. By noon, her bank accounts were frozen. By evening, the news stations were running the story, prominent socialite arrested for embezzlement and fraud. By the next morning, 40 years of federal prison time stared at her from across a courtroom, and everything she had built, her reputation, her influence, her power over people through gossip and social pressure, had evaporated like morning mist. Justice had not come as death. Dominic had been clear about that. Justice came as consequence. Justice came as the systematic removal of everything a person had built. For Preston, it meant years of pain and humiliation in the hands of men who had genuine cause for vengeance. For Margaret, it meant public exposure, the loss of her social position, the cold concrete reality of federal prison. 2 different prisons. 2 different sentences. But both of them destroyed completely, both of them removed from Vivien's world as completely as if they had been erased. 6 months had passed since the November night that changed everything, and spring had come to New Orleans like a blessing no one had asked for. The mansion's gardens had transformed, magnolia trees bloomed in cream and pink, wisteria hung in purple cascades from the iron trellis, and the rain-slicked streets of winter had given way to warm afternoons that smelled like growing things instead of desperation. Vivien Rivera stood in the library with afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall windows, casting her shadow long across the polished floor, and she was not cleaning anymore. She was reading. A business textbook on non-profit management lay open on her lap, her highlighter paused mid-sentence, her expression the kind that only comes when someone has learned to breathe freely again. The shadows under her eyes had faded. The weight she had lost to fear and hunger had returned to her frame in the form of health, not softness. She carried herself differently now, her spine straight, her chin raised, no longer folding herself small to disappear. Her hair, once perpetually pulled back in a tight bun, fell in waves past her shoulders. But the transformation was not visible. It lived in the way she held a coffee cup without her hands trembling, the way she laughed at Noah's jokes without that sound catching like a sob in her throat, the way she could sit alone in a room without scanning the shadows for danger. Noah was 8 years old now. His birthday had been 3 weeks ago, celebrated in this very garden with the kind of party that children dream about, balloons that Vinny and Franco had spent 45 minutes inflating while making ridiculous animal shapes, a cake with his name written in chocolate, presents wrapped in paper so bright it hurt to look at. Noah had laughed so hard he snorted juice out of his nose. That was a new sound in his life. That was the sound of a child who no longer slept with his shoes on. The enrollment letter had arrived in January. Online business courses, paid in full, with Dominic's quiet instruction, you will finish this. You will run your own non-profit someday. Vivien had tried to refuse. She had tried to explain that she could not accept this, that she was already in his debt for everything, for safety, for healing, for the apartment in the mansion's east wing where she and Noah slept without locks because there was no longer anything to lock against. Dominic had not argued. He had simply placed the enrollment papers on the desk in her room, said nothing, and left. That was his language now. Not words but actions. Not demands but invitations. 3 small gestures had arrived across the months like evidence of a tenderness no one was supposed to witness. The first came in February when Vivien found an envelope on her pillow containing hospital receipts, her mother's medical bills, every single one, paid off completely. No note. No explanation. Just the proof that somewhere in this house, someone was erasing her past suffering one official document at a time. The second was Wednesday nights. Every Wednesday, Dominic would sit with Noah for 2 hours teaching him chess, moving the pieces with patient instruction, never once asking for gratitude or acknowledgement. The boy had become good at the game. His father had played once, before the world had broken him. Now someone else was giving Noah that gift. The third gesture had broken something open in Vivien's chest when she learned of it. The nursery upstairs, the one that had remained sealed for 15 years, had been packed away. Dominic had not told her he was doing this. Vinny had mentioned it in passing, the way men speak about significant things while pretending they are trivial. The crib, the changing table, the tiny clothes that had never been worn by the infant son who had died when Dominic was 28 years old, all of it had been donated to a children's hospital downtown. The nursery was empty now except for afternoon light and the ghost of grief finally being allowed to rest. When Vivien had asked him why, Dominic had looked at her for a long moment and said only, "It's time." But the most complicated gesture had arrived without being spoken at all. It lived in the way Dominic looked at her when he thought she was not watching. She would be reading in this library, or reviewing her coursework at the kitchen table, and she would feel the weight of his attention like a touch. She would turn and find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes containing something that made her breath catch. He would disappear before she could address it, leaving her alone with the question hanging unanswered in the silence. His hand lingered longer than necessary when he passed her coffee. Their conversation stretched past midnight, moving from safe topics like Noah's progress in school to dangerous territories, her dreams before the world had shattered them, his understanding of what it meant to be broken and still choose to live. But Dominic had never crossed the line he seemed to be standing directly on. He had given her space. He was waiting. Vinny had noticed. Of course Vinny had noticed. He was sitting in the kitchen one afternoon with Franco, both of them pretending to discuss business while they monitored the building's security feeds, when Vivien walked past in sunlight. The look on Dominic's face as he watched her had been so transparent, so completely unguarded, that Vinny had turned to Franco with an expression of absolute certainty. "Boss is in love with her," he said quietly. Franco had barely glanced at the screen. 15 years I've known him, Franco replied, never seen him like this. Vinny leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Think she knows? Franco was already shaking his head. She knows. She's waiting for him to see she's ready. The evening of a warm May day, as the sun hung low over New Orleans and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Noah's birthday party was winding down in the garden. Children had been picked up by parents who looked at Vivien with a mixture of relief and apology, the same parents who, 6 months ago, had stopped inviting Noah to birthday parties because his mother was the woman everyone whispered about. Margaret Harrington had been thorough in her work. But Margaret was in federal prison now, 3 years into a 40-year sentence, and the whispers had transformed into something else. They had become apologies, tentative kindnesses, offers of friendship that Vivien accepted with grace but did not quite believe in yet. Trust, she was learning, was not rebuilt quickly. Vivien found herself alone on the terrace as the last of the guests departed and the caterers began clearing the tables. The garden was a mess of deflated balloons and napkins and the detritus of joy, and she did not move to clean any of it. Instead she stood at the stone railing and watched the sun touch the horizon, watched the light turn everything golden, and tried to understand the feeling in her chest that was not fear and not sadness but something that resembled hope so closely it frightened her. Dominic emerged from inside the mansion without a sound. He was still in the clothes he had worn to the party, a dark linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, expensive in the way that required no label, his gold watch catching the last light of the day. He positioned himself beside her at the railing, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body against the evening cool. They stood in silence for a long moment. The sound of the city carried to them over the walls, distant traffic, voices, the hum of life continuing in a world that did not know anything had changed. "I've been thinking about that night in the alley," Vivien said. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened on the railing. "The night you were bleeding and I gave you my coat." "So have I," Dominic replied. "Every day." She turned to look at him fully. "I gave you that coat because you were dying and I couldn't walk past that. I couldn't see someone suffering and pretend they didn't exist. You gave me my life back because?" Vivien paused, searching his face. "Why? Why would you choose a stranger over your own safety? Why would you protect someone you didn't know?" Dominic turned to face her completely, and in his eyes she saw something that had been building for 6 months in silence. "Because some people shine brightest when the world tries hardest to keep them unseen. And I spent 8 years in darkness until you appeared in the rain. I was waiting for someone like you. I didn't know I was waiting. But I was." Vivien's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not the same woman who cleaned your floors." "I know," he said. "You're stronger now. You stand as my equal. That's why I waited. I needed you to heal. I needed you to see yourself the way I see you before I could ask you to see me." Her voice broke slightly. "I'm not afraid anymore. Of Preston, of Margaret, of being alone. But I'm terrified of this. Of you. Of what I feel when you look at me like that." Dominic stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin. "Then we'll be terrified together." He lifted his hand and cupped her face gently, mindful of scars that had faded long ago but that he would never forget were there. He kissed her as the sun turned the sky the color of fire, and in the mansion's window, Noah pressed his small face against the glass and cheered. Inside the kitchen, Vinny and Franco high-fived in silence, neither of them surprised, both of them understanding that they had just witnessed something they would never speak of, a man learning how to live again, a woman learning that she had never been invisible at all. 1 year later, the gardens of the mansion had become something more. Not just a place of beauty, but a place of purpose. Vivien ran a non-profit from an office on the mansion's first floor, Safe Harbor. She had named it a place where women escaping domestic violence could find housing, legal assistance, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were seen. That their suffering mattered. That they could rebuild. She stood beside clients as they signed lease agreements for small apartments, her own story a map they could follow toward safety. Noah was 9 now, his walls covered in academic achievement awards, his room filled with the casual evidence of a child who no longer needed to be afraid. The ring on Vivien's left hand was simple gold, elegant in its refusal of ostentation. She wore it without ceremony because the ceremony had happened quietly on a spring morning in the mansion's library, just the two of them and the weight of words that neither of them had needed to say aloud. Dominic's hand rested on her shoulder now as they stood in the garden where everything had changed, watching Noah build a fort out of cushions, his laughter carrying across the warm afternoon. Preston Mercer was never found. Rumors suggested that debts accumulated in the shadows, paid in ways that no amount of federal intervention could correct. Margaret Harrington served year 3 of 40 in federal prison, her name transformed into a cautionary tale whispered at the charity galas she would never attend again. But Vivien had learned something that no one could take from her. Some people shine brightest when the world tries hardest to keep them unseen. And sometimes the most feared man in a city is the one who has been waiting his whole life for someone brave enough to see him in the dark. She had given her last coat to a stranger with $200 to her name, never knowing that one act of invisible kindness would be seen by the one person who understood what it meant to be invisible. That kindness had saved him as much as he had saved her. And now, in a garden filled with light, they were both finally visible. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with the people you love. Every comment you leave is a precious source of motivation. We wish all of you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace.